Okay, so hi everyone, welcome again. Um, Most of you look familiar, but I'll still say my name again. I'm Mandy Reed. I'm the postdoctoral clinician at CAPS, and I'm here with Dr. Dornheim, who is a neuropsychologist, and she works on the BBC campus. So today is the 5th session of our 8-session series for ADHD in college students, and today we're looking at the overall concept of like, how do I remember things, like studying memory strategies and things of that nature. So we'll get started. Like always, you can send things in the chat if you have any questions, clarifications, or just, general feedback. Okay. So here again is our contact information. The first couple of slides I'll skip through just because we've been through these before. They're just the services that we offer at CAPS and the things that we have available on our website. Okay. Sorry for the typo or the...
It is a misalignment.
Yeah, not sure what happened there, but we can still read it. So we talked a bit on this in the last time, but for those who weren't there, the place that we study is going to be really important in terms of the context in which that we are in retaining information. So we want to try to choose areas that we're exclusively using for studying. So trying not to study in our beds or in areas that we tend to associate with relaxation or fun, enjoyment, that we want to kind of keep them separate. Again, you want to have that visual stimulation and visual reminder. So having study aids or study guides that are either typed or written out, having a physical sense of the things that you need to be covering. And that way also you can keep track of what you've done with your own personal notes. Sorry if you can hear banging. I don't know what they're doing upstairs. But if you can make your own notes on it, check off whatever it is that you've already completed and things of that nature. It makes it really personal to your process. And that's something that's really helpful. So again, trying to study in areas that are quiet. So not with the TV on, not with the radio. And again, that depends on the type of learner that you are and the way that you tend to learn best. Some people with ADHD might need some sense of stimulation, and that can be through sound, meaning like classical music sounds or things that are more like background noise versus like things that will be like external stimuli that's impacting your ability to focus. So it's really paying attention to what you find to be effective, and while at the same time reminding ourselves that we're not good at multitasking and we're not good when there's a lot of input of information at one time. Trying not to study in areas where you fall asleep. So as I mentioned, like not places that you associate with sleeping or relaxation. Our bodies can tend to do that like unconsciously. And so if we're in the bed or on the couch or something like that, we're kind of by nature in that frame of mind. And so we talked last time a bit about routines or things that we can do in the process of getting in the study mode. And that is a big thing, that sometimes we don't make connections with those behavioral or just like even our posture, things like that, where our bodies can kind of tune into that even without us recognizing. So it's like when you're sitting down to study and you're all of a sudden so tired and you get up and you're wide awake afterward. It's that kind of association that we talk about. So then looking at the time of day that we're studying, so studying during the early morning, afternoon, and early evening, since you'll better retain information. So again, I mentioned this last time, sometimes it's really difficult to not study at night when, that's when our schedules are sometimes freed up from like work and other obligations that we have within the day. But also paying attention to, sometimes when you're studying at night, you read the same page 15 times and you still don't remember what you've read. So really, is that the best time to be studying? It's really navigating for you what's going to be most effective. And like I said, some people are really night owls and they can function at that time. So that's going to be something that's really, really important. Study during times when you'll not be distracted by friends, extracurricular activities, or work responsibilities. So again, scheduling that time and honoring that time. So not just scheduling it, but making sure that you're respecting that time that you've set for yourself. And then this last line is very hard to see, but don't study when you're tired. So again, that sense of studying when we're tired, we're likely reading the words, but the retention of that information is really not going to be great the next day. So what we know is that sleep is really important for the consolidation of information. So if we read something new, that's why there's such thing as overstudying, because if we read something new and we keep going over it and over it, we're not giving our brain the time to step away from it, to process the information, consolidate it, and store it, so that the next day when you go back to study, you can access that information. It's kind of like, that's why we don't recommend cramming, because we cram the night before, we read all those things, and then you're in the test and you're like, oh my God, I knew I read this. I cannot for the life of me remember what it was. And so it's that sense of that information was not, effectively stored because we didn't allow for that space and time for that. So we'll get more into that as we go through this presentation, but that's just something to keep in mind as well. So now we'll transition more into like the how do we study? And again, it's kind of like one of those things. The last time I said this about goals, but I think it's similar for studying, where throughout school, our teachers tell us like, okay, so you need to study for this test, you need to do this. But a lot of kids really don't learn how to study. And maybe some kids don't need to, right? Like, so through elementary, middle, high school, maybe school is your thing. Maybe you're more able to compensate in different ways and not have to study. What we know is that as we transition to college, that doesn't work as well, even when you're a student that excels in school, right? Like, it's a significantly increased amount of work. The difficulty of the work increases, the amount of things you're juggling and managing, the types of assignments you get are different. So, things that maybe worked in the past sometimes don't work in college. So I think this is it might seem really primitive or like very dumbed down in a sense to these skills, but I think a lot of people don't fully learn that. So I'm going to break them down a little bit. So again, I apologize if some of it is repetitive for those who were here last time, but a lot of these things build on each other. So the first thing is scheduling our study sessions, right? So scheduling those things in advance. We want to avoid distractions. We also want to honor and respect that time so that we know we've scheduled it, it's going to happen. Unless something catastrophic or unexpected comes up, this is going to happen. We're identifying our goals for the study sessions, and we're being specific about those goals. This is one I think that sometimes we forget to do, or maybe there's like a misbalance of like having a reward for reaching a goal. I think oftentimes we think about that with kids, right? Like they do something great in school, you go on the merit board and you put your thing, or you get a reward. And so as human beings, we know that we kind of respond to that positive reinforcement, right? So even at an older age, it's still rewarding yourself in different ways to help you feel like you've accomplished something, but also help refill you in a way that you can come back to it. So maybe that's watching a movie, playing a game. Now, everything in moderation, that there is a threshold, right? So if you're binging a whole show in one day because that's your reward for finishing one assignment, that might not be the most effective reward, but it's really managing for yourself, like what is going to be satisfactory, but also on a moderate scale, that this is not detracting from the other things I have to do as well. So I think that's really important. We want to structure our sessions by organizing content to be studied in chunks. So again, I mentioned this the last time from an information processing theory. Chunking information is a way to kind of minimize, again, that cognitive load. So last time we talked about it in reference to highlighting, color coding, bringing attention to the things that are important or the things that you want to retain in your memory. Similarly, with information, we wanted chunking means like information in a specific topic area. We're focusing in on that. A benefit to this as well is that we're limiting boredom. So if we know that we're studying this specific thing, especially if it's a class that you're not really that into or interested in, you know you're studying this for a specific amount of time. And at the end of this time, you can shift to something else. Versus, I think in the past, or in anyone's study strategy, they might study like one subject for the whole day, and then they're like, I'll switch to something else tomorrow. And that can be effective. However, for someone with ADHD, we know that their ability to sustain their attention on one thing is shorter than someone who's maybe typical functioning. So it's really helping yourself out where you can do good work in a certain amount of time and then allow yourself to shift to something else afterward. It's really working on your own strengths and helping, with those transitions as well. Then we want to schedule in breaks, because breaks, again, similar to sleeping, when we step away from something, we're able to take the information in a more like long-term sense. But also, we just need a mental break. Like if you look at any of the research, it shows that a human's attention span or ability to sustain attention on one thing is about 7 minutes. So I'm not telling you to study for 7 minutes, but I'm just saying like that's oftentimes when you go to presentations or you do things, they try to shift in different modalities of presenting the information, meaning like visual things, and then you watch a video or hear a clip. So there are different ways that we want to keep stimulating ourselves. And just by nature, our brains are not good at sustaining attention for a prolonged period of time. So it's really being realistic in the goals that we set of how long we're spending on something. All right, so we want to identify what concepts are the most important to understand before studying. This, again, is related to, I think, highlighting, being able to take important information out. Sometimes you see someone has highlighted the entire page. In some ways, that's counterproductive, right? Because what the point of highlighting is we're trying to bring attention to the things that are most important. Someone with ADHD, they might experience difficulty picking out what is the relevant information, what stands out, what is more important than the next. And so it's really helping yourself comb through those different things and finding systems as a way to help you recognize like, okay, this is the main point of what I need to know. These things are kind of more excess details that I don't need. So again, it's a skill, or it's something that you can develop over time. It also, I think, directly relates to being in class and being in tune to what the information and what the topic area is in order to help yourself make that connection to what you're reading. This is one that I think sometimes people don't recognize that this can be a tool, but reading chapters out aloud, there's also something different about like hearing something, but also like verbalizing it. So some people are auditory learners, like they learn from hearing. So that person might do really well in a lecture where you're listening to someone talk on end, which is kind of like what I'm doing right now. But so someone who is like constantly talk, or like in a lecture, someone is talking. Some people are really good at just learning like that. Some people need to read the information or need to have a visual, so like a diagram or have a physical representation of something. So it's really important to know how best you learn. And for someone who learns auditorily, being able to read something out loud, you can record yourself and listen back to it, like when you're driving or doing something else. Or I think a lot of the books also have recordings now that you can also play that. So it's really tuning into how best do you access that information. We want to summarize what you read and write down a summary. So this is a difference between like rote memory, like when we swat flashcards or things on them. Oftentimes you can recognize by seeing something, but it's really different to reiterate it. And that's how we really consolidate that information, and we know that we've learned something. You're able to read it and then produce it in your own words. And so we do really recommend that. If you, from a biological standpoint, that's activating different parts of our brain. And so the more parts of our brain that we can activate doing one thing, is the more likely that information is going to be stored. So that's often why we say physically writing is it has been correlated with higher memory and being recall, because you're using more tactile, more sensory neurons and things like that that are storing the information. If you think about your fingertip, that's a minimal amount of neurons that we're using to type. So that's why a lot of the research is showing that being on the computer and working on the computer is not necessarily the most conducive to memory and learning as it is writing something down, which isn't to say it's not helpful. I'm not saying that. But if you just think from a biological standpoint, writing something down can really be an aid in storing that information. We then move on to mind maps. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this, but for someone who's a visual learner, this is something that can be really effective. And it's kind of based on the idea of assimilating new information, right? So assimilation means like you know something already, and you're taking in new information and making connections with what you already know, right? So visual maps can be like visual representations of your thought process or the information that we have, and helping to like physically make connections to things that you know, but also having them in diagrams, graphs. I know for me when I'm studying, that's extremely helpful to like have something I can, in my mind, have a picture of it and say, okay, wait, I know these different parts of it. This is how I'm remembering. And so that's something that's also really helpful. Create questions that could be used on exams and write them on a different piece of paper. So we want to be critically thinking as we're going through. We're not just what we know about college, and even more so in grad school. It's different to high school where you study something and you reiterate it on a test. A lot of these things are more applicable, right? So you have to manipulate that information in response to a question in order to answer something. It's not just reiterating information that you've read, it's really processing and using it in a practical sense. So to be able to start thinking critically throughout the process and thinking about what might be asked of me, or how might I use this information to bring this specific situation to life or to explain something, that's going to help you to start you manipulating that information in a way that could be helpful for you on a test or an exam. Again, we want to take breaks, but after a break, you come back to the summary that you wrote and you reread that summary. We want to keep refreshing, right? So just because I think this is the misconception as well. Because you've studied it and you've learned it, put that aside and you start something new. Yes, and you go back to it. So each time you're learning new things, you're still going back to the core of what you already knew, because that's how you add on to it. And that's how you maintain, the memory of that information, and also make connections with new things. So these are just some tips. I'm not sure if these are things you all have tried or have found to be effective, not effective. You can always send in. All right, so some more things. I think lectures or being physically in class is really important. Sometimes I hear, I can't bother to go to class, I'll just read what it is. Yeah, okay, you could still learn the information, but like I was mentioning earlier, I think in lectures, you're able to have a more holistic sense of what the professor is really zoning in on. They might have anecdotal stories or ways in which you can bring a theory to life, but also more easily remember it and access that in your memory. I remember when I was in college, I would write like example, like in relation to theories, I would write down the examples that they're telling me, because I can more remember that. And I can come back to it and say, wait, yeah, I remember that. And I can connect it to the theory. So sometimes in class, I would be writing, like just writing nonstop. Like I wouldn't even fully know I'm writing, and I can go back to it and then kind of put those pieces together. So again, that's my process, but I'm just giving an example of how that might be helpful, which is, some of that information was not in the textbook. So when you're not in class, you're missing out on a lot. Dr. Dornheim has a comment.
Yes, you also, when you listen to the lecture, you kind of get the idea what's important for the professor and what's less important. So you know which topic will be on the exam and which topic you might want to not to put too much attention to it.
Right, exactly. Um, I know people have mixed feelings on this other point, like always being prepared to class. So reading the mandatory material before going to class. I know some people prefer to go to class and then know kind of what to focus in on and then read afterward. I don't think there's a right or wrong, but it's essentially saying that you should still be knowing the material that is given to you to do outside of the classroom. So I think both those elements are important. Dr. Dornheim has a
Yes, I think for me it was always important to know the material beforehand, because when I did not understand something, I wrote it down and I was able to ask the professor and to get an answer to my question. When I would not have read it, I would not have known.
It's funny. It's funny how people like do things so different, because I did the opposite. I wouldn't read before because I would want to like be present, and then I would go back and read and be like, oh yeah, this all makes sense. So I think it just depends on the person, but it's, you know, highlighting that both those elements are going to be important, and it's probably trial and error figuring out what's most effective for you. Okay, these typos are kind of throwing me off. Oh, sit front and center. So sometimes I have people come to me and they're like, you know what, I think I have ADHD, I need medication, whatever. So in doing the assessment and talking with them, it's like, okay, where are you sitting in the class? Oh, in the back of the classroom. Okay. What are you doing while you're in the back of the classroom? Well, I have my laptop open, my phone is on my lap, I'm scrolling through, and I'm listening to my AirPods. And my response to that is like, you know, maybe we can try do different things before we jump to that conclusion. And so helping to minimize the distractions, not listening to things in class, not sitting with a group of friends who you know that you're going to chat with or talk about whatever happened last night. Like being able to sit in the front and the center, you're kind of in the spotlight. Who likes to sit in the front? It kind of brings more attention to you, but you're also forced to be closer physically to the information, but also attentionally you're more able to zone in. And so that's something that I always talk with people about, that let's try these different variables first and see how that impacts you. Shut it off. So, you know, I think it's hard because our phones are such a like central part of our functioning nowadays. My emails come on this, my messages, everything. And so for me to turn that off is really difficult, but sometimes I think we have to do it because it's such like a reflex. Sometimes I notice I'm just like looking in my phone. I don't even know what I'm looking for, but I'm going into the phone. So like sometimes it's really creating that distance, and sometimes that includes turning it off. We want to make meticulous notes by hand. So as I mentioned, that's activating more brain centers and it's helping you consolidate that information more effectively. And also not only more effectively, but in a more long-term sense. So if we think about the different types of memory, our working memory, our short-term memory, and our long-term memory, right? There are different types of memories. So when we're cramming the night before, we're really just working on our short-term memory. After that test, go back to that information in 2 weeks and tell me if you remember that. I mean, if you do, that's great. But I think most times it doesn't stay that much longer in our brains. So if we think about our working memory, that's our ability to use that information while manipulating it and figuring things out. But long-term memory, that's when we're able to like study something at the beginning of the year, learn it, get it into our body, in our mind, and we can come back to it even long after and still be able to access that information. So I think it's important to differentiate those things. And I'm not saying everything requires our long-term memory. Some things you kind of just have to do, but for the things that are important, that's a big one. And again, so taking notes with the exam in mind. So paying attention to the content that your professors are emphasizing, and being able to use that while you're studying. All right, so this is a note-taking method. from Cornell. I'm sure you're all familiar with the university. So we're just going to break it down a little bit, because I think this is another thing. Like when we take notes, there sometimes, for someone with ADHD, if you look in their notebook, you might see writing over here and then no rhyme or reason, but then something down here, and there's no kind of logic to the way things are laid out. And then when you go back to it, you're like, wait, what in the world was I doing or thinking? Because it doesn't make like coherent or logical sense. So with this note-taking method, it entails taking a piece of paper and dividing that in half. So vertically. So you have the left and the right. The left area is for notes. Again, we highly encourage taking handwritten notes if that is possible for you. And then leave the right side for any questions. Those could be questions that come up for you, things you're uncertain about, or it could be questions that you're asking yourself, again, to help prompt a thought related to that piece of information. So in the lecture, you want to write down as much as you can. After class, you rewrite it neatly. And these notes are going to be used as prep for your exam. So this makes life so much easier when like midterms come up, finals. And I know sometimes who has time to do this after class, but it's really getting in the discipline of like challenging yourself to do that. Because the quicker you can manipulate that information when you've just learned it, the more likely you're able to then work with it, retain it. And then when you come back to it, it's more of a refresher. It's more of like revisiting, recalling that information versus newly assimilating or consolidating that information. So this is a technique that, we use throughout the semester, and it helps prepare for a midterm, a final, whatever that is. When you don't understand something in class, be sure to address that. Ask the professor, the TA, whatever the resources that you have, in order to not have that thing pending, so that when you're studying for an exam, you're like, wait, I never did figure out what that was. Now I'm in a bind because the test is in 2 days, even though I hope you'd be studying more than 2 days. But you know what I mean? So if it's someone who does experience maybe some social anxiety or anxiety around talking with professors or things like that, there are also other alternatives or ways. Well, my recommendation would be to do it anyways. Challenge yourself to think about what's the worst case scenario, what's the fair, and what's going to happen. But if you want to reach out by email, go to office hours, whatever it is, it's helping yourself gain that information. Again, after class, rewriting the notes, questions, and doing assignments, soon after you've gotten that information. We can take pictures of the notes so we can have them wherever we go. I think I mentioned last time that I'm studying for my licensure exam. That's something that you have to constantly be studying at. So if I'm, waiting in the car or doing something, like I'm constantly just reading, doing. And so having something on your phone is a really quick way to do that. And then if you're struggling in class, there are definitely other resources that you can use. And we highly recommend seeking support. So the DRC, which is the Disability Resource Center, is an excellent resource to use if you have a diagnosis or think that you might. Is having those accommodations, for example, extra time or differential seating or private testing, things like that, that can help you really focus in with those difficulties. There's tutoring, the Student Success Center, and then also, of course, CAPS is another resource that you can utilize as well. Okay, so how do we study for exams? I mean, I know I've kind of been alluding to some elements of this, but we have the 3 R's. Read, retain, regurgitate. So, like I mentioned earlier on, cramming is not ideal. We've all been there and done it. However, it's not necessarily the most productive way to learn information. An effective strategy is called spaced repetition. So That is when you have a small, frequent review of your study notes over a long period of time, right to the test day. So that was kind of what I was referencing before, where you're constantly going back to those notes. You're just constantly reviewing, going back to it, not saying, okay, I studied this, I know it, I'll leave it till the next 2 weeks and then come back to it. Because what we know is that you start losing certain details or elements that might be really important. Yes. I'm just thinking of like my own experiences of what, might be
No,
helpful, but sorry, go ahead.
I'm currently studying Portuguese, the language Portuguese, and with a computerized program. And every day there pop up vocabulary or other questions or other sentences that I have to answer. Or to translate or whatever, which of material that I studied months before, even a year before. It just, reminds me that I will not forget.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I guess in the way that I'm connecting with that way of studying, I mean, obviously what I'm doing now, but when I was doing my doctorate, we have to do comprehensive exams. So that's everything you've done throughout all the years.
Oh yeah.
In consecutive days of exams. So it's like, if you try to study for that 1 week before, you are likely going to fail. So you have to study, repeatedly, coming back to it again and again, and revisiting, because yes, we know it, but it's keeping it relevant and fresh in our minds as well. So it depends on the amount of material you need to remember, how your strength in that particular subject area or that particular class. Something that is really effective is doing self-tests. So just testing yourself, quizzing yourself. I know I mentioned flashcards earlier on. So typically, right, you have one word on one side and the definition on the other side. It's testing yourself in ways where don't always study it the same way. So like not always studying the one word when you read the definition, but instead switching it sometimes, like saying, let me look at the word, let me say the definition and see if that's true. Because sometimes that's harder. So it's doing it in different ways to test yourself, but also help learn the information. I think it gets tricky because, again, to this last point, right? So when in doubt, study more, but only study content you do not know. So we want to still do those refreshers, but we don't want to like intensively overstudy, right? So it's a hard boundary to really say what's overstudying. But for you, I think like if you know the material, it's a quick refresh and you're moving on. It's not like intensively sitting again with it, reading through every, fine nook and cranny. So I think sometimes that's difficult to differentiate. Okay, so we mentioned this before, taking time to schedule before, like scheduling study time. Start with a complete review of all the material that you have, and then write down the content that you don't understand. So I think this is a good way to gauge like what are the areas that you need to work more on versus the things that you already feel like you kind of have a grasp on. So you do an overall review, and then really zone in on the areas that need whether clarification or just more work on them. So the ELF test. So if you have any practice exams, like past papers or things from previous years in that same class, or if you're doing like say you're doing the GRE or something that's outside of the context of school, but still being able to practice that kind of exam or the way the questions might be asked or the expectation of how they would be answered. So starting with those and using that as a gauge, as a way to remember information as well. Okay, this one is huge, everyone. So if this is the only thing you take away from today, that when you're studying, if you're studying effectively, right, the day before the exam, you do a final review maybe before bed or whenever it is, a final review, then you go to sleep. Go to sleep Maybe you wake up and glimpse your summaries or your slight study notes. You go to the exam and don't look at anything again. Because I think what happens is some people get anxious, or they're like, I need to just do a last quick look. And sometimes you can confuse yourself. Or if you're like, my pet peeve is talking to someone before an exam, because then you get their input and then it might muddle what you've already learned. So it's really trusting yourself. Once you know that you've done your studying, you know the material, go to bed, allow that information to sink in, step away from it. You're not going to forget it. And then you do a quick review in the morning, maybe not even a quick review, and you go to the exam. So it's really helping yourself, one, minimize that anxiety around doing it, but also not interfering with the long-term memory that you've really worked on consolidating. So I think that's one that I think that's where the overstudying can come in, where you're like intensively studying half an hour before the exam. That's not always helpful, because again, you get to that place of like, oh my God, I just read this and I cannot remember what it was. So you don't want to get in that place of confusing. All right, let's keep in mind, this is a very ambitious person. This schedule, that's Dr. Dornheim's schedule. She's very ambitious, but again, keeping in mind our schedules are very particular to us. These are very closely booked back to back, but there is nothing wrong in having space in between. I know for myself, there's no way I can do that. I need to take time away from it and come back to it. So there's nothing wrong. It just depends on how you work best. But the idea that we want to show here, though, is that we have an overall view of what we're expecting. I know sometimes I need to mentally prepare for a day of just knowing what's coming up, and then you can kind of go with emotions, like not necessarily things you might enjoy, but you're going to do it anyways. And so blocking in 1 hour chunks and, scheduling in. So here, Dr. Dornheim has put in like specific things in these areas that she wants to work on. So the bioassessment and self-test is at 9 a.m. after she studied from 8 to 9. So it's really being strategic in what you're doing and being intentional. So you're like, between this time and this time, I'm going to study. Between this time and this time, I'm going to test myself and figure out what it is I don't know. And then I'll make a list of things I need to come back to tomorrow. And that's fine. You do that for one day, and that's good. You switch maybe in the evening to something else. So it doesn't have to be consistent throughout the whole day. So this is just an example. Okay. I know I've been talking for a long time. If anyone has any comments or questions, please send them in, or unmute yourself if you feel comfortable to do so. Okay. So in our schedule, we're including the prep before class. So it's not just the things that we need to do, but we're including in time for prep, time for working on homework assignments, and including, like you saw, the self-test. So you want to still schedule in time for that as well. An assignment summary reviewed before class. This helps you to kind of really get a sense of what the assignment is. So like Dr. Dornheim said, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns about the assignment, you can get more information while in class. I think sometimes it's really difficult when you haven't looked at it and then you sit down to do it and you're ready to get going, and then you realize you don't know what you're doing, or you don't understand one part, and then that sets you back even more. Note-taking in class. I know it's much easier to type than write, but writing is really something that helps with the memory, as we've been saying throughout, just reiterating. Notes and questions rewritten after class, and then review readings and things that are assigned.
No, what it means, these are 4 reviews you did, plus 1 questioning session for every chapter in your book you did before you even thought about going to the midterm or to the final. And that means you are already pretty well prepared without having to cram, just by doing this.
Yep. So Dr. Dornheim's strategy is we want to work smarter, not harder, right?
Yes.
So you want to set yourself up so that you're not like immensely stressed during finals, which you still might be, but like helping yourself out. We want to help ourselves out. We want to minimize that stress. And these are ways to do it. So during the semester, it might be more of a pain, but when you come to the end and you're ready for the test, you know, it kind of works out. And to me, feels worth it. All right, so memory hacks. So we want to try to understand the information first. It's much easier. I always say in learning, in studying, it's much easier to learn the information than to have to memorize it. Once you've learned something, it doesn't matter how you're saying it. It doesn't matter the wording. You know the concept, so you can then reproduce it or understand it. So the first step here is link it. So we want to, again, this is what we talked about kind of in the mind maps. We want to link it to something we already know. I find that to be extremely helpful, and it's helping you think of, you know, just even ways that you can remember something. So sometimes I make up like letters or words, or if this word reminds me of this, and that's what, like, I don't know if that's a weird way to study, but for me that really works. So it's helping yourself just make connections, not just the information that you know, but also like sensory things. Like when I hear this, I think of the waves, and that's related to the whatever environment system that I'm studying. I don't know. So just thinking of ways to connect it to something that you're likely going to remember. And that can be something totally personal to you, where someone might read your notes and be like, I don't know what this is. That's fine. If you understand it, that's all that matters. Sleep on it. We've highlighted the importance of sleep. Self-test. Use distributive practice. So actively recall information several times. So not just studying it once and saying, yeah, I know it, but you're going back to it again and again. And the more you do that, you come back to it, and it kind of comes more like that, because you have it already in your long-term memory, but also it's easy to recall and get into that working memory of, you know, using that in a more critical way. Talk to yourself. When I was in grad school, I think my neighbors thought I was crazy because I was talking aloud, right? So sometimes being able to explain something out loud helps you so much. Like teaching someone something can help you learn that as well. So it's talking aloud, helping you get that into your body. And also, if this goes as well for presentations, that, you know, sometimes you read through your presentation over and over, and you go to stand in front of the class and your voice shakes and it feels really weird because it's not in your body. Like, you need to get that practice, and the same goes for studying. Exercising, getting your body moving, releasing the tension and the stress that builds up inevitably, and helping yourself regulate in that way. Last time we talked about the endorphins that are released and the hormones, and this is a natural way in which we can use our bodies and our minds. I think our minds are a big part of working out, as a way to regulate stress, and as a way to more, you know, holistically and like overall protect our well-being, and being able to come back to things in a place that we're able to take information in. So this is really important. And then using the 5 senses while studying. So this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, like still being able to, you know, utilize the different elements of the way we input information. And so if you can make a connection with something you're reading to maybe something you're smelling or hearing, or relate it to things that you've felt or smelt or seen in the past, you're more likely to recall that information when you need it. Using metaphors. So, sorry, this thing is, not sure what's happening here. Okay. Sorry about that. So using metaphors. We want, again, we're trying to make as much connections as we can. And so if it brings something to life for you, yeah, you're more likely to remember it. Oh, okay, so that's it. These are our resources on campus, but I really would love to hear from you all. If there's anything that you weren't aware of that you learned today, or if this was more just like a refresher, or if you're leaving with something that you might try out.
I have, you can talk. I unmuted all yourself. Or you can unmute yourself.
Nope. Nope. Oh, wait, we have a comment. More of a refresher. Cool. Well, good. I mean, I'm glad to know that you've already been utilizing some of this stuff. So that's great.
Any questions? Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think the thing with studying as well, that can change too over time. So what you might have done earlier on might be different now. Sorry, Dr. Dornheim, what were you going to say?
It also depends a little bit perhaps on what kind of area of expertise you're getting in and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, for example, some things are more hands-on. When I learned to become a biofeedback therapist, I had all these machines I had to learn how to operate. And that was a lot of manual learning and less memorization of things. But I needed to learn procedural things.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think it really depends on the nature of what you're doing. And I think even within the same subject area, right? Like when I was in undergrad, that felt significantly different to be in grad school, and the way that you utilize that information. So yeah, I think everything demands something different from you too. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for being here. Hopefully it was helpful, and again, we're totally open to feedback and comments as well. So thanks so much. We are doing session 6 tomorrow, I believe.
1 second. Nope, it's Monday, June 15th, 1 p.m.
Okay, sorry, Monday. So hopefully we'll see you then. Cool. Okay, well, I hope everyone has a good day and good weekend, since we won't be seeing you, and we'll touch base on Monday.
Yes. Have some fun too.
Thank you. We get comments.